Hi, this is Sandy Banks, a columnist with the LA Times, and I want to welcome you to our video chat today. We have a fascinating subject, I think. I wrote a column about Rachel Dolezal this weekend and her efforts at passing for black. She's the head of the NAACP in Spokane, or was before she resigned because of the controversy on Monday. My take was as a black woman particularly, I felt not offended, but kind of demeaned by the idea that someone can so easily presume to know what my life is like because for the past few years they've declared themselves black. But what bothers me wasn't so much her adopting the posture of being black, but her lying, first of all, and making up stories about her background, but also because she in her position as a professor is presuming to lecture other people about what it's like to be black. Which leads us to a whole big conversation of what is it like to be black? What is it like to be white? What are the elements of race that we ought to be worried about today? And we have two people with us here today to talk about that from different perspectives. Camille Gear Rich, who is a professor in the USC School of Law. It's the Gould School of Law, and she is a race scholar and someone who talks about elective race and that concept. And so we want to thank you for being here, Camille, and we're going to come back and get to her with that.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
And we have Dexter Thomas, who is a PhD candidate at Cornell in East Asian Studies, and he's working on a book about Japanese involvement in hip hop, if I think I have that right.
Yes.
And he's going to talk to us a little bit about an essay that he's written that looks at the transgender, transracial issue as if they are or are not partners, and what makes us so fascinated by this. So I want to start with Camille first and just talk about what is elective race. It's something that I mentioned in my column that she talks about, and it's important because race is not just how we see ourselves, but it has legal and social and political implications, and the idea of people being able to self-identify and declare what they are is something that we're going to have to wrestle with as we go forward. So what is elective race, Camille?
So I just wanted to start off by thanking you again for giving me the opportunity to talk about these issues, because I think they're fascinating, and I've been writing about them for a number of years, but I think the Dolezal controversy has really brought this to a head.
Yeah.
So it used to be that we lived in a time when people's physical bodies matched how they saw themselves racially. That era, it seems, has ended. People have far more complicated understandings of what their individual racial identity is, and those understandings shift over time. Sometimes they shift in terms of context, sometimes they shift because of life events, sometimes they shift because of the form that they're given that asks them to identify what their racial identity is. And because people have these much more complicated approaches to understanding what their individual racial identities are, we find these inconsistencies in terms of how they identify in public spaces. The era of elective race is really marked by people's demand for recognition of the identity that they choose, autonomy, and being able to make these different choices at different points in their lives. And I think Dolezal actually makes us think they actually think they have a sense of racial privacy, that they should be able to keep the facts about their racial background secret, or at least confidential from certain people, so that they can present themselves in the social world in the way that they feel is comfortable.
That's listening to that explanation, which is fascinating. It leads directly, I think, to what Dexter talks about, and that is, some of the points that she's making about people declaring and keeping things private and all relates really specifically to, I think, transgender people as well. So tell us a little bit about why we, in our minds, link that and what you think that means, Dexter.
Right. And thanks also for having me in. So I should say, first off, that I'm actually in no way qualified to talk about transgender issues as such, being that I'm not trans. But I think that it is really interesting that we almost immediately, and perhaps it is because of sort of the time-wise proximity of the topic of Caitlyn Jenner, but a lot of people really started out almost immediately saying, well, if Caitlyn Jenner can say she's a woman, then why can't Dolezal say that she's black? And it's a really difficult problem. And a good friend of mine, Meredith Telezon, wrote a really good piece in The Guardian talking about why this is not okay. And basically, in short, she is saying, I am a woman, and this person is saying she identifies as Black. And you'll notice, actually, if you listen to what Ms. Dolezal is saying, she always says, I identify as Black. Generally now in the interview, she's saying, I identify as. But I think it's interesting why we're having these conversations. And in short, I think it's really because it's showing us that we actually understand gender and understand race a lot less than we thought we did. Mm-hmm. But also, I think, and I can talk about this a bit more, I suppose, but one of the things is that before Dolezal became a topic, the word transracial actually was being used sort of all over the internet. And there were two types of people who would use this. The first type was people who were angry that Caitlyn was, quote unquote, tricking people. And this is usually white males, actually, that were angry about this. And they would say, okay, well, if Caitlyn Jenner can trick people, then maybe I can be Black and I can get these good Black scholarships and get all these handouts that Black people are getting, you know, really sort of cynical. But there was actually a fairly serious group, and it's a much smaller group, but there's sort of this niche group of basically anime obsessed kids on Tumblr, I would say in their teens, sometimes early 20s, that really want to be Korean or really want to be Japanese. And they would give themselves Japanese or Korean names. They would edit their photos to look more Asian. But in both of these cases, what we're talking about is we're talking about people going from the top of a certain hierarchy, a racial hierarchy, to the bottom of a racial hierarchy. And so this transracial conversation is really talking about going downwards, which I think is really fascinating. It's sort of the right to present it's basically slumming it, I suppose. It's the right to slum it, I guess.
I have to say my hackles get raised just even listening to you say that, because part of what bothers me about this whole thing, and I said this in my column, what insults me is the perception that you're moving down, that somehow, you know, Rachel is taking on this horrible burden-filled life if she becomes Black. And for all the you know, the statistics and all we know, most Black people I know are not living lives of, you know, horrible oppression. I mean, we know things aren't fair, and we know what comes with the deal, but it's not, we're not wallowing in some kind of sense of victimization. And so the idea of this racial hierarchy kind of is what as you said, makes what she did so fascinating, but it also says something, I think, pretty ugly about the persistence of things that are supposed to be fading. I don't know, does the hierarchy play into this, Camille, in what you see and what you write about?
I mean, all of this is really fascinating, and to sort of respond to both your question and Dexter's comments, I think the transracial term is really an important moment for us to kind of sort out a lot of different things that are going on. So white male rage or anxiety about affirmative action programs could show up in the form of them making arguments about being transracial, right? But those are arguments we've kind of seen before, and they're kind of a mockery of the term. They're not an attempt to take it seriously. Oh, yeah, the Asian sort of persona that some of these kids are adopting in terms of their online life, or this sort of limited space and the kind of slumming that you talk about, is certainly deeply disturbing, and I think is also associated with, more generally, creating a kind of virtual persona that allows you to live out a fantasy, but it's not a life that you would actually want for yourself. I think there's a third group emerging, or at least that's the group I'm concerned about in my scholarship, which is people who rely on misrecognition in order to gain access to intimacy with minority communities. Those people often see themselves as transracial, so they go through life hoping people sort of get a little bit confused about who they actually are. And they do that because being a white person, and typically I think it is a white person, being a person who's outside of that particular group is sort of painful for them if they're really invested in that community. And that investment can come as a consequence of family relationships or experiences with others who are talking to them about discrimination, if they're interested in certain cultural forms and their interest seems inauthentic because they're not a member of that group. So I think there's a sort of new group of people who might be lumped in this transracial group, but there's a lot of stuff going on under that term. And it's sort of why I prefer the term elective race, because I think it sort of taps into our anxieties that people are just sort of making these choices and flitting in and out of identity categories in this kind of opportunistic or like cultural tourism sort of way. But there are also people who are affirmatively, consistently, on a regular basis claiming an identity that they don't have any biological or ancestral claim to. And they often do it quite successfully and sometimes do positive things in this sort of limited way that we can say with Dolezal. And the question is are their claims authentic? Are they living authentic lives? Is this something that we should be concerned about? What happens when they seem to take up space that is being reserved for people who are ancestrally, genealogically, physically trapped in a particular racial group? What is it exactly we're talking about when we talk about race? And she sort of, although she's not the ideal poster child for these issues, she certainly forces us to engage with them.
And that seems to be where the bulk of our questions have come from with readers. And they talk about, there's really no universally accepted definition of Black or African American. Does someone need to have half of their DNA or to have come recently from Africa, or what's the limit? So what entitles you to the label? And, the group that you talk about, Camille, people who, and I think, many of us have known people like that, people that you feel close to, that work with you, that are, part of your share your sensibilities and your concerns about civil rights, and they're not Black. And I think the community has always kind of welcomed those people. But what you're talking about is that they want to feel authentic, and so they take on that label, which is concerning, because if you consider yourself then Black, you consider yourself, the spokesperson for those things. And that seems to be where the trouble lies, which raises a whole nother issue: is why do we need spokesperson? Does anybody? I don't speak for all Black women any more than Rachel does. So that's a whole nother question about our fascination with labels and who counts and who has status and who has credibility. Do you see, kind of, Dexter, a different perspective among younger people on these issues? And, a lot of the readers just say, what's all the fuss about? I don't get it. Do you see that among your peers?
Yeah, well, I mean, especially if we're going to talk about young people, I think one interesting thing, especially if we're going to talk about how do we define Black? Is it half Black? Is it quarter Black? Are we using the one drop rule? Do we need to bring back the paper bag test? If you don't know what this is, how light the
ask
skin
Rachel
is,
if you don't know. Yeah.
But one really interesting thing that I thought is, and I'm gonna have to bring up Black Twitter, is the Ask Rachel hashtag, which I thought was really fascinating, because basically, if you're not familiar with it, the Ask Rachel hashtag is this sort of series of cultural insider jokes that every Black person should know. So, for example, rolling down the street, smoking Indo, sipping on
Gin and juice.
Gin and juice. Okay, right. Look at the flick of the wrist, right?
Right.
So,
or is she on fleek? That's the one I actually tried to put in the column, but I didn't think people would know. So her eyebrows on fleek.
Right, eyebrows on fleek. So the funny thing about this is there's a lot of Black people who would completely fail these tests.
Right.
Completely, utterly and spectacularly fail these tests.
Thank God we passed.
But you're okay, you're Black. So we're all in the same club here. But there's, I can guarantee that there's some white kids in North Dakota who would ace everything. And that's because all of this socially coded, quote unquote, Black knowledge, rapgenius.com, urbandictionary.com, which, by the way, these are not Black owned sites. You can find all of this information on there. So if we can't tell a Black person by looking at them, and we can't tell a Black person by some kind of verbal secret handshake, how do we identify them? And I think that's what is partially as confusing about this, because really the thing is, I mean, we should be able to say, oh, this person's a con artist and sort of leave it there. But we're back here talking about this because I think it freaks us out. And I think it is really confusing to us, I think.
But I think you can be into these things and you can be down for the cause and you can do all that without having to claim that race. And we have even a viewer who writes in, Raphael, who says, I think it's okay to embrace and identify with another race's culture. I'm into K-pop and I'm really into Korean culture. I watch the shows and listen to the music, but I am proud of my Hispanic culture. And that seems to kind of get at it. Rachel doesn't have to be Black to be the head of the NAACP or to teach in Africana studies. And so I think what has made this so interesting is her sense of that she needs to be Black, which leads to, is there some, nefarious reason that she wants to get some, affirmative action things, or is it just that she wants to belong and that she feels, as Camille said, not authentic? So that's kind of, are groups exclusive or not exclusive? Can you be part of it without having to be of it,
These are really great questions, and I have tried to sort through some of them to provide some paradigm, although it doesn't comprehensively answer the Rachel question.
Yeah.
So, right, there's a couple of different ways that Blackness matters, or that being a minority person matters. One is how people treat you, right? Stereotypes and discrimination. And often that's triggered by your physical body.
Mm-hmm.
It could also be triggered by the way you act. So there are plenty of people who sort of visually appear either ambiguous or even appear white, but they behave in ways that mark them as Black and show they affirmatively connect with Black communities. Those people experience discrimination too. Then there's a person that doesn't look Black, doesn't quote unquote act Black, but identifies as Black on every single form that you put in front of them. They have a Black grandmother or someone and they're proud of that heritage, and they take on, right, the label of Blackness, even though it might expose them to discrimination. They're unwilling to deny it. All three of those groups, I think, are entitled to the protection of anti-discrimination law, right? Are all three of them entitled to affirmative action benefits? Well, that might be an interesting question, right? Because some of them, especially the person who doesn't visually appear Black and doesn't sort of act Black, may not be experiencing the same social stigma. They may experience some, but it might be different. All three of those categories, right, are of interest to me because I'm a lawyer. So I want to know what anti-discrimination law and what affirmative action should be structured like. But what's sort of disturbing people about Rachel is a social question, right? Just when should you socially be able to claim a racial identity? When should you be able to enter a community? Should you be able to pass? Should there be rules about that? And who gets to decide what those rules are? When we're in the social domain, and this is where my CNN.com column got me into trouble, is people are like, oh my God, she's letting anybody into the category of Blackness. Well, no, that's not true, not for the purposes of affirmative action or even anti-discrimination law, but for the purposes of social community. I think communities get to decide who's Black in their given community. I think the community of Spokane is now sort of traumatized by this revelation, but they would also think, right, that she did some good work and had some positive connections there. I've heard from friends that she actually went a bit far and was actually policing Blackness and telling some Black people they weren't Black enough and not letting other people of color participate in certain political organizations or events. And that's deeply troubling. But I also know that's pretty common with people who don't feel like they have a strong hold on Black identity. That is, you've encountered Black people who maybe appear a little bit ambiguous, and sometimes they're a little bit more aggressive about policing Blackness than people who feel more sort of centrally located in that category, so they have less to prove. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of her regrettable behavior is certainly understandable, and it's about this anxiety, it's about this trauma that she has about not really having a hold on the identity. But I think as far as the social question is concerned, I think the community that she lives in gets to decide that. And it's not for me to tell her that she can or cannot invoke a Black identity.
Wow, I think that's fascinating because it does suggest that there aren't like a set of rules or like you said, the test, that people passed, as Dexter brought up. When you say they get to decide, what do you mean by that?
Well, so the big problem in her case is that she lied.
Yes, yes.
So usually when a community gets to decide, they're presented with all the information, right? Yes. And they may have been content to let her enjoy a certain amount of misrecognition. Although I think in talking with a lot of Black women about this on Facebook, some of the misrecognition issues, even with her taking on a Black cultural aesthetic, really, really disturbing to them.
Yeah.
But I think they would have at least been able to have a conversation about that. Like, oh, she really likes our aesthetics. She's adopting some of them. Okay, we're fine with this. Do we feel comfortable with her being a leader? Like, what are the politics of all of this? Is she dabbling? Is she seriously committed? Is this about her family and her trying to protect her sons? Mm-hmm. What is all this about? They could have had actually a real conversation about that. She kind of took that conversation away from them.
Yeah.
She made the decision for herself. And I think that's a big part of the betrayal that they could be feeling right now.
And, I think passing is a big issue here, but passing is not as cut and dried as we kind of talk about it as. I can remember my brother has a friend that was a friend for a long time. And I spent most of my life thinking he was Black. He had a Black wife, he had Black children, he grew up in Detroit. And it wasn't until years into the relationship that I realized he was not Black, he was Jewish. And he was not trying to pass, but he sounded Black, he acted Black in my perception of Black. And I found myself feeling truly embarrassed that I couldn't tell, But in fact, I wrote about that and it launched a lot of conversations among people who had inadvertently passed because they looked or acted a certain way. But I think what aggravates me with her is that she's not content to just pass, and she's not even content to claim the label, but she has to, as you said, police things and say, for instance, that Tim Wise, who is white but writes, quite often about white privilege, shouldn't come to the campus to speak because he's white, and white people shouldn't be leaders in Black lives, and white people shouldn't do this. And that's what I think is galling, is that you have, first of all, appropriated and then set yourself up as gatekeeper. And it does, again, raise the issue, who are the gatekeepers then? But it's the lie that's troubling, I think, and not so much the label. Dexter?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was
to get in.
fascinating that you said, that you were talking about, I think you said anxiety is one of the things here. And I think, well, even before that, I think when we talk about the Black community, she sort of took the decision away from the Black community on how she should be able to interact or represent them. Again, it comes back to what I was saying about Black Twitter, is that we're not a monolithic community. If 99 Black people say it's okay and one Black person says it's not okay, is that a community consensus? Is it not? Is half and half okay? We very rarely talk about what the white community thinks about something, because we recognize sort of instinctively, not all white people think the same. But I think we sort of stop when we're talking about, say, minority communities. Oh, well, this is what the Asian American community thinks. This is what the Indian American community thinks. Things like that. But I think the conversation about anxiety is really interesting, because I think this is where we might think of Ms. Dolezal as a really extreme version of, really extreme result of what some people have called white fragility, which both of you may be familiar with, which basically white fragility, it refers to when the topic of injustice comes up, white people will get really defensive and say, I don't have anything to do with that. Slavery's over, leave me alone. I'm not enslaving anybody. My parents didn't own slaves, things like that. And so a lot of white people do not have this problem at all, but a lot do. And what happens is it turns into something that's about guilt. And so when you're trying to talk about racism or injustice, and we could even broaden it to talk about homophobia, transphobia, things like that, it's not about the problem itself. It becomes all about them. And they have a really difficult time realizing that, okay, this is not about you. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm saying that there is a problem with society, and that's it. And sometimes people just get angry. Sometimes what people will do is they will sort of insert themselves into the problem where, for example, if you're talking about police brutality, they'll say, oh yeah, police, man, I hate police. I got a traffic ticket last week. And it's like, okay, this is not what we're talking about. Sometimes they'll take it a little bit further and they'll actually manufacture a solidarity, or so they can sort of take part in your struggle. For example, getting dreadlocks and then having a boss tell them, hey, you shouldn't have dreadlocks at work. And, then they want to come and complain to you, man, having black hair in the workplace is really hard. It's like, you don't have to have black hair in the workplace. You have a choice about this. And so I think we might actually think of Ms. Dolezal's actions as sort of a really extreme version of that, because the thing is, the closer you're able to get to blackness or whatever problems are, the less guilty you have to feel. Because you get to say, oh, well, I'm experiencing this too. And so this is a really extreme version of that. And I don't want to say it's unprecedented, but I've never heard of it happening really. But I have seen baby steps towards this before, where, like I said, people say, oh, well, the police bothered me too. I was skateboarding and they bothered me. Well, they bothered me for existing. They're slightly different.
But there's not a competition, or there shouldn't be, who
Exactly.
gets who's, most maligned. And that's what kind of is troubling, that this does shape up as that sometimes. We had one of our commenters to our coverage say that America remains too label focused, especially when it comes to race. This whole sorry episode validates how far we are from being able to have a sensible and constructive dialogue about race. And I, in some ways, have to agree with that, because I think this is a sensible and constructive dialogue. But I think there are so many elements to this that it's hard to use this to mean something that's going to resonate the same across different groups. So what do we use this to say? What do we, what's the kind of the message here?
Well, I mean, I agree with you that I think there is an opportunity for constructive and helpful dialogue. I think your example of the dreadlocks is a really interesting one, because when you said to the white guy, well, you don't have to have dreadlocks in the first place, but neither do you. Right. It's just as much of a choice. It's a choice that's connected with a certain cultural history, and you have a dignity interest in it that maybe you don't think he has. Maybe his is a little more like just experimentation. But there needs to be some precision about that, because sometimes white people will punish a white person even more for having dreadlocks than a black person, right? It's actually really disturbing to them to have white people take an interest in black aesthetic forms. And so there are lots of things that happen to white people who have attachments to minority communities that I think both put them in a sort of strange state of alienation, but also they're constantly told, you're not really a part of this group. You can't have access to this experience. You're different. Just to give you an example to show I'm equally implicated in this, when I was starting out at Yale Law School, I had a friend who approached me and she was like, oh, Yale's wonderful, Yale's great, Yale's fantastic, I'm going to tell you all about it. And I listened to her patiently and gave her a nice nod. And then she said, I'm black, right? And I didn't know she was black. And I didn't change anything I said to her, but something shifted. Right in the conversation, something shifted. She might not be experiencing the same social discrimination I do, but I felt like she had tapped into, or at least was interested in, the same set of issues. And I'm sort of baffled as I look back at that incident and thinking about this particular controversy as well, because that's what Rachel was interested in. She was interested in that moment, in that shift when I opened up. And I consider myself a progressive person. I like white people.
Don't we all?
But something happened there, right? And so I think that's what she was tapping into. And a lot of people say, well, no, she just shouldn't have access to that space on any terms. And other people would say, well, she has 2 sons. And she was married to this man, and she's worked for this community for years. And why does she never get to experience that moment when that shift happens?
And I think that's what makes this so volatile, and it's what keeps us talking about it, because it gets to things that are inside that we may not acknowledge even to ourselves. And I hope that we will continue this. We're going to wrap it up now, and because we realize we're not going to resolve anything here. We're all black, and we're coming at this even from different places. But I would, yeah, go ahead, Dexter.
I would say, I think the reason why that it really is bothering us so much, and the reason why it is sort of, there's so many heated opinions coming in from sort of all angles, is that I think instinctively somewhere we know that the conversation really shouldn't be about how to categorize Ms. Dolezal or how to punish her. It's that we know that the solution to this is not to categorize or punish her. We know that we need to be working on ending racism. And that's such a huge problem that every time we get sort of faced with that, we try to sort of break it down into, oh, well, this is just a bad cop being mean to some black people, or, oh, this is sort of a crazy lady faking it. But no, the solution to this would be to end racism so that the idea of quote unquote faking would be senseless. It wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't even be a topic, but we're not there yet. And I think that conversation is really difficult to begin to have. We're here now, but this is the first step, I think. But I think that's part of what is really sort of worrying people.
I think that's a great way to end this, and to continue this conversation using the hashtag defining race. We hope you'll weigh in, because there's the big mega problem, and then there's the smaller issues of our day-to-day interactions. And I think all of those play in this, and it's a conversation. I'm glad that we've started this conversation. I'm glad that we can talk about this in a way that's not good guys and bad guys. And I hope we'll continue it on the hashtag defining race. Thank you.